You ready? Okay. Hearing will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to the Over-Criminalization Task Force third hearing. Thus far, the task force has examined over-criminalization issues in federal statutory law. Chief among them is the absence of a defined mens rea or intent requirement from the federal criminal code. Congressional statutes, though, are merely the tip of the iceberg. Over the last 50 years, there's been enormous growth in federal regulatory state, and with it, a shift of power from elected officials to unaccountable bureaucrats at federal regulatory agencies. Nowadays, the vast majority of laws governing individuals and businesses in the United States are passed not by Congress, but are issued as regulations crafted by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. There are at least an estimated 4,500 criminal statutes on the books today, up from 165 in 1900, but as many as 300,000 criminally enforceable regulations. In other words, the ratio of regulatory crimes to statutory crimes is 67 to 1. This hearing is not about the substance of all these regulations. That is a discussion for a different day. The question before us is solely on the propriety of criminal rather than civil penalties. Criminal sanctions are serious. They carry terms of imprisonment, create stigma, and can have lasting economic consequences such as diminished employability and ineligibility for government benefits, in addition to other life-changing problems, as the stroke that we have seen with one of the victims of this over-criminalization. Accordingly, they should only attach to violations that society generally recognizes as morally blameworthy. This hearing is about when, if ever, such onerous criminal sanctions are appropriate punishment for violating agency regulations. If so, how should those crimes be defined? And most important, who should be making those decisions? It has become a routine practice for Congress to authorize an agency generally to promulgate regulations while providing that violating the yet-to-be-seen regulations will be a criminal offense. This poses a series of fundamental problems beyond the already familiar lack of adequate notice of intent requirements. First, the bureaucrats who create the regulatory crimes are unaccountable to an electorate. This makes them immune from public opinion, which operates as a check when it is instead the legislative branch making criminal law. By contrast, legislators have the broader societal perspective necessary to determine what behavior society deems most blameworthy and therefore the proper subject of criminal sanction. Similarly, as a result of these broad congressional delegations, the substantive regulatory standards that define regulatory crimes are drafted by agency bureaucrats largely shielded from public debate. Their efforts do not have the benefit of the full, open, and public scrutiny that helps improve legislative definition of crimes in Congress. The result is less transparency and deliberation precisely when such procedural protections are most needed because individual liberty is at stake. Regulations are also much more dynamic than traditional statutory crimes. Requirements change with evolving science, and standards sometimes rest upon assumptions about the efficacy of unproven technology. This complicates notice and compliance, which seems unfair if violations are to bear criminal penalties. Another factor is that regulatory crimes can be created indirectly when statutes forbidding certain general behaviors, such as lying to officials, are applied to regulatory infractions that are not otherwise criminal. The result is criminal sanctions for activity that may be far removed from what Congress contemplated when it delegated rulemaking authority to the agency. Finally, prosecutorial discretion and appeals to the courts may not be sufficiently effective fail-safes for unfair results from regulatory crimes. A collection of liberal and conservative groups, including the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation, produced a pamphlet of examples of cases that I believe most Americans would agree should never have been brought. In the courts, precedents have eroded intent requirements in the context of regulatory offenses while demanding greater deference to agencies' interpretation of the scope of their rulemaking power. Accordingly, agencies are now able to expand their criminal lawmaking power even to areas that Congress did not specifically commit to the agency. In short, the enormous growth in the regulatory state has been accompanied by an explosion of regulatory crimes. If unaddressed, the growing problem of otherwise law-abiding citizens jailed for violation of ill-defined regulations is a morass of rules of which they cannot possibly be fully aware, and that threatens to undermine the legitimacy of the criminal law and dilute its moral force. We have an excellent panel of witnesses with us today, and I thank them for being here. I know you're not here because of the pay you get, but and for people that may not know, they don't get paid. They're here because they care about what we're doing, and so we're very grateful for your presence. And knowing the story of some of our witnesses, I feel like an apology is due. But in any event, I look forward to hearing your testimony today. Appreciate you all being here. And, you know, people sometimes ask, why don't you guys in Congress get along? Well, it depends on what the issue is. But I now want to recognize a friend, a ranking member of the task force, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott, who together we have been concerned about this issue and working together for years, and it's an honor to recognize Mr. Scott. Thank you very much, Ms. Kinder. At this time, we'll begin questioning. Each of us will have 5 minutes, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Lewis, Ms. Kinder, as a judge, I have looked into the eyes of many hardened criminals and sent them to prison. I've looked into the eyes of a couple of people and ordered they be taken and put to death. But I look in your eyes and my heart breaks for what you've been through. And I am very sorry for your travails that was brought on by a system that doesn't seem to have worked as it should. So thank you for being here to hopefully help us get our system corrected. Professor, you had clerked for Antonin Scalia. I was with a group that he was speaking to, a small group, and one of them, and when he said, "What questions you got?" one of them said, "Would you say our country is the freest in history because we have the best Bill of Rights?" And you know Justice Scalia, he's very abrupt, and he said, "Oh gosh, no." He said the Soviet Union had a better Bill of Rights than we do, and I'd forgotten I did a paper on the Bill of Rights in college, and they did. They had more enumerated rights than we do. That was not the key, and Justice Scalia pointed out we're the freest nation in history because the founders did not trust government, and so they made it as difficult as they possibly could to create laws. And I see the case of Mr. Lewis, Ms. Kinder, so many others that Mr. Scott and I have listened to over the years and read about, and it looks like one of the biggest problems is when none of those safeguards are utilized, and agencies, bureaucrats, totally unaccountable, make the rules, make criminal laws. Mr. Lewis, you mentioned a civil penalty. Obviously, this whole thing was embarrassing. Take the criminal violation alleged out. Do you think you would have ever allowed or been a part of sewage moving as it did if you had been fined or had your pay docked, some civil penalty like a fine without ever going through the criminal court, you think you ever would have done that again?
Absolutely not. In fact,
If you would, yeah, there we go.
in fact, everywhere I've been since then, I make everybody around me aware, look, there's some laws out there you may not be aware of, and there's certain things that I see, if I see some concerns with it, some possibilities with it, I share it with the people around it, with the employer and my coworkers. No, if I had any idea, there's no way I would risk my family being in a shelter somewhere to stop water for anyone. I would have never done that, you know, knowing that that would result in me going to a prison. I would have never done that.
Well, Ms. Gohmert, do you think, given the embarrassment and what are you, just from having government agents come and talk to you, do you think if you had been civilly fined without ever having to go through the criminal justice system, that you would have ever violated such a regulation again?
Of course not, Your Honor. I would like to say a little bit more about that.
Okay.
We operated in the day of light. Our nets were, you could see them for a long distance away. We had big buoys that floated on top of the water. We fished that river in those same holes for 7 years. No one ever told us that we were doing anything wrong. No one ever told us to move our nets. No one ever said anything that we were doing wrong. Even the Ohio and Kentucky officials, they didn't know that there was a boundary. I guess they figured there was a boundary out there, but no one knew how to identify it. So in 7 years, we were never said anything that we were doing anything wrong by Ohio, Kentucky, or the Coast Guard.
Thank you. Mr. Rubenstein and Professor Barkow, as it's one last question before my time runs out, and our lights have been really messed up here. But do you think that we can solve the biggest part of our problem by adding an intent, a mens rea requirement to statutes such as what captured Mr. Lewis and Ms. Kinder?
Just before I answer, with answering the questions, these are my opinions, not necessarily those of ILR. Yes.
Well, it's you that's testifying, so it's your opinion. I'm not asking anybody else's.
My opinion, yes, that the lack of an intent requirement, particularly when you are imposing criminal penalties, is tremendously problematic at a human level, as you heard, and at a systemic level, it undermines, you know, the basic bedrock propositions of our entire polity. It has to be fixed.
Thank you.
I guess the only thing, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is it's complicated to draft that in a way that's not going to raise some of the same issues, because the federal criminal code doesn't have any default rules about how you apply mens rea to different elements. So unlike lots of states that follow the model penal code, where you just assume if Congress puts a mens rea term in there, it applies to everything, there's no default standard for congressional statutes. So even if you plopped in the word knowingly or willfully, there'd still be an interpretive question for the courts of what it applies to. So if you did do that, you'd want to make clear or pass a default rule that says it applies to all the elements of this provision.
Okay, thank you. And we would welcome your submission of anything in writing you think would do that trick. My time's expired, and at this time, it's my pleasure to recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes.